Our panel to talk about it now from the Independent Women's Forum, senior policy analyst Liz Stepman, Wall Street Journal associate editor John Bussey, and New York City Council Minority Whip Joe Borelli. Welcome all. We took it live, John, as they thought it was important to hear the vice president outline the administration's positions on China. Some had said before that it was going to be almost conciliatory on trade. And maybe, to Edward Lawrence's reporting, there were a few olive branches mixed in. But it was also a very tough speech. What did you think?
Yeah. Look, it's probably incumbent upon the president right now to sound tough on China because the trade talks are not going great. This mini deal that was gotten a couple of weeks ago was basically the same old China. We're going to buy your goods, all the other problems, push them to the side. That's what it was. We're not going to raise tariffs any further if you increase your agricultural goods. No timetable for that. No specifics behind it. It was kind of a kick the can down the road. So this tough speech, which is quite interesting. This is, we're not going to decouple from China. We're not trying to contain China. When in fact there are sort of elements of containment in the policy of the government right now. But it's easy kind of for the administration to take Nike to task when it itself has not really been out front on supporting what's going on in Hong Kong.
Today, maybe the most aggressive commentary we've heard from this administration and as about Hong Kong. And it was in that part of the speech, it's always have to be careful in assigning causation in this situation. But that's when the market went to its lows when he was talking aggressively about Hong Kong. It's since come back to where it was earlier. But he really went after it there and went after Nike and the NBA. What'd you think?
I think it's really great to hear that from this administration because, like you said, this administration actually, strangely for all of Trump's bombast, right, when it comes to the topic of economics with China, he's been quite soft on human rights issues. He's been quite soft on this NBA issue, which was a huge story that you would expect a Trump tweet out, right? He had a kind of mild tweet where he made fun of them a little bit, but you would have expected him to hit on those issues. He hasn't. So I was really, really pleased to see Mike Pence hit on this issue. I think one of the ways that one of the problems the president has had with this issue in general, with the trade war and everything else, is he's talked about it purely as an economic issue. And when you're talking about it purely as an economic issue, then Americans are going to look at the hits that tariffs, have created for Americans. But if you talk about it as a national security issue, if you talk about it in a way that asks Americans, look, we might have to sacrifice a little bit in the short term economically because these guys are geopolitical opponents and they do not wish us well. I think that's a message that the majority of Americans actually do believe and will support and fall in line behind.
I heard the CEO of a major corporation, Joe, say recently that the president, in his view, has morphed in his position in China, that he started off saying, they're ripping us off and we need to do something about this trade deficit. And now he sees it much more broadly. And maybe to the point that Ness is making, maybe that's what we saw in this speech today, that it's a much broader fight. Yeah, maybe we can cut a short-term deal on certain things that help us both economically or stop the pain, so to speak. But we have to deal with human rights. We have to deal with these issues.
No, right. And I've long been a supporter of President Trump, and I think one of the more fair criticisms by some of his critics out there has been that as the China trade deals have progressed, there really hasn't been any commentary on the NBA issue, on more broadly speaking Hong Kong human rights. I do think that this is a step in the right direction. I do think giving a little bit of pushback, at least, I wouldn't say this is really dropping the gauntlet on China, but it is certainly a change of direction for the administration to begin to start confronting these things. I would contest what John said. I think the China's National Development Chair also just said that they've agreed, in essence, to no longer discriminate between foreign companies and domestic companies, meaning Chinese companies, in terms of intellectual property. I think that is a fairly good progress.
Well, they've made some comments today that I think if they were made, a good point, a month or two ago, the market would have shot up. And I think it's actually interesting that it didn't in some respects. I don't know if it's like a boy or cry wolf syndrome or people say that if China... And in my view, China would have agreed to have made a deal on intellectual property a year ago. The question has always been whether they would agree to a deal that's been enforced.
Right.
Now, Peter Navarro claims that they have. We don't know whether that's the case or not. I guess that's the old saying, time will tell.
Exactly. Enforcement. They agree to these things constantly. They say we're not going to keep your goods out. We're going to normalize our standards for what you're allowed to bring in. We're going to increase, kind of thinking about government procurement and the government, buying your goods as well as buying, and then there's no enforcement.
Right.
This is lots of talk on the part of China, decades of this, and kicking the can down the road. And so that's where we are in the trade negotiations. We don't have anything of substance yet. And that frees up, I think, the Pences and Trumps to talk tough on China very good point, I think, on this national security front. When Pence speaks this way, when anybody in Congress speaks this way, it is a bipartisan acclamation.
Yes.
You get points on both sides of the political spectrum. Right. The American public is behind this kind of rhetoric at this point.
Right.
But it is a substitute for practical, real progress on the trade front, which we don't have.
I want to transition a little bit. It's all related. It's all the same to talk about American companies. And I think it's kind of interesting today what's going on with Nokia. We'll show the stock price just as an example. It's getting hammered. It is down by 23, almost 24%. And the reason is the company came out and said on 5G, which is important to the U.S., important to China, of course, the competition is hurting them. They're spending a ton of money on it, and it's more expensive than they thought, essentially. So the stock's getting hammered. So that brings up Huawei, because that's who Nokia is competing with here. Huawei is the leader in 5G. Nokia is kind of chasing them. And I spoke this week with a top executive at Huawei who told me in the interview that U.S. businesses are actually still interested in working with Huawei on 5G in kind of a roundabout way. Let's listen.
We can license, the 5G patents or the products to any potential American partners.
Do you have any lined up?
Yeah, we do have some inquiring and interesting, they have some parties ask about that.
Okay, so some U.S. companies, just so we're clear on what has actually happened, have come to Huawei and said, we want to license your technology. That's where we are now.
No, they just want to ask what exactly means, we have an interesting, that's it.
Okay, but that would give you a kind of a footprint still here in the United States, so to speak.
Now, it's still too early to see.
So, guys, just quick comments on this. But Joe, think about that for a second. We blacklisted Huawei,
right.
But now it's going to say, all right, you blacklisted us. Let's sell this technology to other, and that puts Nokia and Ericsson in a tough spot, right? Because they're competing.
I think Yahoo Finance put it the best today, frankly, by saying there was almost no excuse for Nokia to fail. I mean, given all the geopolitical opposition to Huawei's expansion, it's amazing to see that Huawei was still able to sign more contracts with places
Tell you what
to
the
have
problem
5G
is.
build-outs.
That other countries are still working with. Germany, for example, they haven't banned Huawei. We don't know what the UK is going to do. Real quick, John, and this.
Cheaper. Why?
Yes.
State subsidies. Why?
Yes.
It's a preeminent Chinese company. It is a product of the government of China. This is a perfect example of what U.S. business and European business is up against.
Yes.
State subsidized entities that can compete unfairly on the global
Right, and it's
stage.
one thing for us to say we're banning them, but now we try to get our allies. The vice president actually talked about this today, and they don't always go along.
So the vice president also made a comment about the Chinese policy of not having a separation between military and private companies, right? And I think that, again, goes to this national security point. And that's why I'm so glad that the administration is finally talking about it from this perspective, because I think as long as we're talking about it from a purely trade perspective, a purely economic perspective, we're missing key points, like when it comes to Huawei, like the fact that, why are people nervous about this company? Because it's so heavily in bed with the Chinese government, and because if we let them in, there's the potential that the Chinese government is going to have a lot of control and potentially access to a lot of things in America, even national security stuff.
And key points, as you guys have pointed out, where there is actually widespread agreement on bipartisan support. All right, well.